Vladimir Putin just lost the most important political ally he had inside the European Union, and the man who blocked Brussels for 16 straight years was thrown out by his own people in a single night. After more than a decade and a half of vetoes, sabotage, and open friendship with the Kremlin, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been removed from power in a landslide so massive that European officials are calling it an earthquake. The man replacing him, Peter Magyar, did not just win. He won a constitutional supermajority, the kind of mandate that allows him to rewrite Hungarian law itself. And within 10 days of that victory, the consequences started landing on Moscow like artillery rounds. 90 billion euros in frozen aid suddenly unlocked. A massive new sanctions package on Russian entities suddenly approved. And a Kremlin spokesman forced to publicly admit that Russia is now searching for, in their own words, pragmatic ties with Hungary's new leadership. What we are about to break down is one of the biggest geopolitical reversals of the entire Ukraine war. Stay with us, because the picture is even worse for Putin than it looks on the surface. Now, let's set the scene. On April 12, 2026, Hungarian voters went to the polls in what international analysts had already labeled the most important election in the European Union for the entire year. The numbers from that day are staggering. According to official results reported by Al Jazeera and CNN on April 13th, voter turnout reached nearly 80%, the highest in any Hungarian election since the country emerged from communism in 1990. 3.3 million Hungarians cast their ballots for Peter Magyar's center-right Tisza party. That is the largest number of votes any single Hungarian party has ever received in a free election. Tisza secured 138 seats out of 199 in the National Assembly, with 53.6% of the vote, while Orban's Fidesz collapsed to just 55 seats and 37.8%. To put that in plain terms, Tisza now controls more than 2/3 of Hungary's parliament. That is the exact threshold needed to amend the country's constitution. Orban himself conceded on election night. According to CNN's live reporting from Budapest on April 12, Orban personally called Magyar to congratulate him. Magyar then walked out in front of tens of thousands of supporters along the Danube River and declared that, "Together, we replaced the Orban regime. Together, we liberated Hungary." Reporting from the scene, Al Jazeera correspondent Step Vassen described what she saw with one line. Budapest, she said, has absolutely exploded into celebrations. After 16 years, it was over. But understanding why this matters requires understanding what Orban was actually doing inside the European Union for those 16 years. And here is where things get serious. According to a detailed assessment published by the Atlantic Council on April 14th, Orban was not simply a Eurosceptic politician with awkward foreign policy preferences. He was, in the words of Ukrainian and EU officials cited in that report, Vladimir Putin's most loyal and reliable partner inside the European Union. He used Hungary's veto power, available to every EU member state, as a personal weapon for the Kremlin. He blocked sanctions packages, he delayed weapons shipments, he stalled Ukraine's path toward EU membership. And just months before his defeat, in February of 2026, Orban was the man who froze the entire 90 billion euro EU loan to Ukraine, a loan that Kyiv was depending on for its 2026 and 2027 defense budget. That last move is what set the stage for the explosion that followed his defeat. Now, before we get to what Magyar's victory has already triggered in Brussels, let's talk about why this loss matters so much for Putin personally. And the real problem for the Kremlin is this. The first scenario, and the most immediate, is financial. With Orban gone, the dam holding back European money for Ukraine just broke. According to Bloomberg on April 22nd and NPR on April 24th, EU ambassadors gave preliminary approval to disperse the full 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine just 10 days after Magyar's victory. Of that total, 60 billion euros, or roughly 70 billion US dollars, will go directly to Ukrainian defense spending. Another 30 billion euros, around $35 billion, will cover Kiev's other budgetary needs through 2027. The structure of this loan is designed in a way that should terrify Moscow. Ukraine only repays the money once it receives war reparations from Russia, meaning the EU is effectively borrowing on international markets and using frozen Russian central bank assets worth around 210 billion euros as the eventual collateral. Putin's own frozen reserves are now being weaponized to fund the very army fighting his troops in Donetsk and Zaporizhia. The defense applications of that 60 billion euros cannot be overstated. Ukraine has been negotiating for additional Patriot air defense systems from the United States, Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles from the United Kingdom and France, and large-scale ammunition contracts with European producers. Each Patriot battery alone costs roughly $1 billion when fully equipped. Each Storm Shadow round, with a confirmed range of around 250 kilometers, or about 155 miles, sells for around $3 million. The math is simple. 60 billion euros in unblocked defense funding is enough to fundamentally restock Ukraine's deep strike, air defense, and artillery inventories simultaneously. And it is money Orban personally tried to keep out of Kyiv's hands for years. The second scenario is even more dangerous for Moscow. It is the sanctions front. According to NPR's reporting on April 24th, the same day the loan was approved, EU ambassadors also greenlit a fresh raft of sanctions against Russia that Hungary and Slovakia had been blocking since February. This new package targets more than 60 additional Russian entities, including dozens of companies and government agencies. It also targets more than 40 ships from what is known as Russia's Shadow Fleet, the network of vessels Moscow uses to illicitly move oil around existing Western restrictions. With Hungary's veto removed, the EU just added these names to a sanctions list that already includes more than 2,600 Russian officials and entities. Putin himself, his political associates, the major oligarchs, dozens of Duma lawmakers, all of them already on it. Now, with Orban gone, that list is going to grow faster than at any point since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. But before we get to the third scenario, this is a quick reminder that you're watching analysis you will not find on mainstream cable news. We bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you stay ahead of the curve as this story develops. Now, the third scenario, and this is where things get even more serious for the Kremlin, is what we could call the symbolic collapse. For more than a decade, Putin has built his European strategy around a simple bet. The bet was that he could find one or two reliable proxies inside the EU, give them political and economic cover, and use them to paralyze the bloc's decision-making from within. Orban was the centerpiece of that strategy. He was the model. He was the proof of concept. And his fall, in a free and fair election with record-breaking turnout, has just shown every other Putin-aligned politician in Europe that the model has an expiration date. According to the Atlantic Council's April 14th analysis, Orban's defeat is the latest in a series of foreign policy setbacks for the Kremlin. In late 2024, Russia's ally Bashar Assad was toppled in Syria and forced to flee to Moscow. More recently, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro was captured by the United States and removed from power. Now, Orban joins that list. 3 of Putin's most prominent foreign partners gone in roughly 18 months. And the fourth scenario brings us to the energy front. This is one area where the picture is more complicated, and we want to be honest about it. Hungary, even under Magyar, will not break from Russian oil and gas overnight. According to France 24's pre-election analysis on April 11th, Magyar himself has stated that Hungary cannot fully end Russian energy reliance before 2035. That is nearly a decade away. The Druzhba pipeline, which delivers Russian crude through Ukraine into Hungary and Slovakia, resumed flow in late April after a 3-month interruption tied to Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. So, Russian gas and oil money will continue to reach Budapest in the short term. But here is what changes. Under Orban, Hungary used that energy dependence as an excuse to defend Moscow politically inside Brussels. Under Magyar, that political defense is gone. The supplies may still flow, but the diplomatic protection is finished. The Kremlin lost the friend, even if it kept some of the customers. What this means for Putin's broader strategy is catastrophic. His master plan for European division depended on Orban acting as a permanent veto inside Brussels. That veto is no longer available. According to chief economist Holger Schmieding of Berenberg Bank, in a public assessment published on April 13th, no European policymaker had done more to weaken the internal cohesion and external influence of the European Union over the past 5 years than Viktor Orban. With Orban out, the EU is now able to act faster, sanction harder, and fund Ukraine more aggressively than at any point since the war began. The reaction from Moscow, when you look closely at it, tells you everything you need to know about how badly this hurts. According to the Russian state news agency TASS, Kirill Dmitriev, a Putin presidential envoy and one of the Kremlin's closest economic advisors, went on to social media after the election and tried to spin the disaster. He claimed that Orban's defeat would only accelerate the collapse of the European Union and challenged observers to check back in 4 months. That is not a confident statement. That is a man performing damage control in real time. The Kremlin's official spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, struck a much quieter tone, telling reporters only that Moscow respects the election result and looks forward to continuing pragmatic engagement with Hungary's new leadership. Translation: Russia just lost a partner, and it knows it. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, by contrast, did not hide her satisfaction. In a public statement on April 13th, she declared that Hungary has chosen Europe. A country reclaims its European path. The Union grows stronger. Even former U.S. President Barack Obama weighed in on social media within hours of the result, calling it a victory for democracy, not just in Europe, but around the world. The contrast in tone between Brussels and Moscow on April 13th was almost cinematic. Celebration in Western capitals, silence and damage control in the Kremlin. But there is an even bigger issue behind all of this, and this is where Putin's nightmare truly begins. Orban was not just a politician, he was a brand. He was the man who proved that an EU member state could publicly side with Moscow, host Putin for state visits, refuse to send weapons to Ukraine, and still remain inside the world's largest economic bloc without consequences. His political durability gave cover to every other Putin-friendly leader from Bratislava to Belgrade to Sofia. The Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, who has echoed many of Orban's positions, was watching closely. So were nationalist movements across Romania, Bulgaria, and even further west. According to analysis published by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies on April 23rd, the weakening of Russia's influence inside the European Union as a result of the political changes in Hungary means that Washington can now rely more on Europe to support Ukraine. The dominoes have started to move. What this means for the war effort is enormous. A united, faster-acting EU means more money for Kyiv, fewer veto delays, and a sanctions regime that finally bites. It means Ukraine's defense industrial base, already producing record numbers of long-range drones, glide bombs, and naval drones, will receive sustained financing into 2027 and beyond. It means Russia's shadow fleet, which has kept Moscow's oil revenues alive despite Western pressure, is now being hunted with more aggressive tools. It means the political cover Putin had inside the European Union for the past decade is, for all practical purposes, gone. The wall he hid behind is rubble. And the question every analyst in Europe is now asking is the obvious one. If Orban could fall, who is next? Slovakia goes to the polls within the next 18 months. Serbia is under massive internal pressure. Even inside Russia itself, the loss of 3 foreign partners in a year and a half, Assad, Maduro, and now Orban, sends a message about the fragility of Putin's network of allies that no Kremlin spokesman can spin away. The next election cycle in Eastern and Central Europe is going to be one of the most consequential in a generation, and Moscow now knows it cannot count on its old playbook to deliver. This is the new reality that Vladimir Putin is waking up to. His most loyal lieutenant inside the EU is gone. The 90 billion euros he spent 4 years trying to keep out of Ukraine is now flowing. The sanctions package he stalled for 2 months is now active against more than 60 of his own entities and 40 ships in his shadow fleet. And every other Russia-friendly politician on the continent has just been shown in real time that the voters can take their power away in a single night. The era of Hungary acting as Putin's Trojan Horse inside Brussels is finished. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next development as this story unfolds. We'll see you on the next.